everybody, Mike here with Delta Faucet. Today I'm going to show you how to install the Delta Faucet R22000, a multi-choice universal integrated shower diverter rough for a shower.
The installation process applies to several models, including the R22000, R22000WS, and also the R22000PX, PXWS, MF, and MFWS versions.
Typically, you'd only be tackling this project if you're doing a bathroom remodel that's been taken all the way down to the studs, or you're doing new construction. Now, if you're tackling that complicated of a project, I'm guessing you have some DIY experience. Just keep in mind that every install is unique and building codes are different everywhere. So if you run into an issue or there are any steps of the install that you're uncomfortable with, I definitely recommend bringing in a professional for some extra help. But if you feel good with it, then let's get started and talk about what tools you're going to need. Then we can move on to the install. Now we're going to be using PEX for our water supplies, but you can use copper, galvanized iron, PEX, or even CPVC. Okay, grab those tools and supplies and we'll get to it. Now here we are in our rough opening, and the first step is to determine where we want to mount our rough valve. Now, there's really no rule exactly about where this needs to go. However, there are some considerations that you want to think through before determining its final position. The first is kind of the vertical height. And for me, I like this to be right around somewhere that's easy to operate, so I'll call about my belly button level, so probably right around here, around 48 inches off the floor. And then secondly, I also want to consider what else is happening in the shower. Now, for instance, I want to make sure that if I have a shower head directly above it, or I have a specific width on my opening, I probably want to make sure it's centered within that opening. Then also I want to consider what the final wall covering might be. So if you're doing some sort of inlay or some sort of large format tile, there may be a specific position this needs to be mounted to make sure it doesn't interfere with any of those design decisions down the road. And finally, don't forget that there will be a trim that will cover this whole rough valve here that will be a little bit wider, so just making sure that diameter of the trim doesn't interfere with anything else on the wall. So for me, I'm going to kind of have it right around in this stud bay here. Okay, once you get that determined, the next important measurement is where we're going to place our blocking. Now, the important measurement here is 2 9/16 inches from finished wall. Now again, I'm going to say finished wall because right here I've got my rough framing, so you have to think about what other materials are going to be added to the rough framing to get to that finished wall depth. Now in my case, I'm going to be adding 1/2 inch of cement board and then about roughly another 1/2 inch of tile and thin set, so my finished wall depth is going to be 1 inch out from my rough framing here. So what that means is I want to make sure my mounting block is 1 9/16 inch back from the front of my framing. So I'm going to take my tape measure, go back to roughly where I wanted that valve before, measure back about 1 9/16 inch, make a little reference line, repeat the same thing on the other side, again 1 9/16 inch, and right around there. Now that I have those positions marked and I know where my rough valve needs to mount to, I'm going to cut a piece of blocking that fits perfectly in between these two studs here, and then we're going to go ahead and screw it in place. Now that I've got my blocking cut to length, next I'm going to screw it in between my two studs here. Again, keeping an eye on where I wanted that rough valve positioned and also making sure that the front edge of my blocking is going to be 1 9/16 from the front edge of my studs here. All right. I think it's a good idea to put a little level on here just to help me get it perfectly level side to side before I drill my other two sides. And then again, checking to make sure this is 1 9/16 back from the front there. Okay, now that we have our blocking in, we can get ready to start mounting our rough valve to the wall itself. But before I do that, I want to talk through the valve just to make sure we're all on the same page. First off, you notice the valve has a top and a bottom. And I can tell which way it's supposed to face up because on the black plaster guard here on the back, you'll notice it has a big arrow with the word up. So I want to make sure that's always facing towards the ceiling. Secondly, you'll notice at the bottom here it's got two main inputs, a hot side on the left and a cold side on the right. And then on the top, it's going to have 3 outputs, a left, a top, and a right-hand side. Now the outputs are important because it depends on what kind of your diverter you're going to be using. Now if you're using a 3-way diverter at home, that means you're going to have 2 outputs. So you have a shower head and like a rain can. If that's the case, you want to make sure you're connecting those outputs to the left and the top side in capping the right side. You always want to make sure you're capping the right side when using a 3-way diverter. Now in my instance, I'm going to be using a 6-way diverter. That means I'm going to have outputs connected at 3 different fixtures, so no need to cap anything at this point. Okay, so once I've got the valve figured out, I'm going to go ahead and place it on my wall. And you'll notice I've marked a quick center line here just to make sure I'm getting the valve in the perfect location. So I'm going to go ahead and hold it on my wall, keeping an eye on that center line, and then also making sure everything looks nice and level side to side. Once I'm happy with it, I'm going to grab my drill. I'm going to run a screw in one of the 2 holes directly below my diverter valve at the top there and into my blocking. Again, making sure everything looks nice and level and driving it into the wall. All right, that feels good and tight, and I'm just checking to make sure it looks level and plumb, and we should be in good shape. So now we can go ahead and make those plumbing connections. But before we do that, I do want to point out that if any of your connections are going to be solder connections, then you want to make sure you remove your test caps, your bonnet nuts, and your black plaster guard, and just set those off to the side to make sure they don't get damaged while you make those connections. All right, I'm going to go ahead and make my connections. You do the same, then come back here, we'll move on to the next step. All right, now that we have all our plumbing installed, we're almost ready to pressure test our system. But before we get to that, there's a couple things we need to check just to make sure we're all ready to go. The first thing is to see if you have water stops or not. Now, there's 2 versions of this rough valve, one that has water stops and then one that doesn't. Now, I can tell my version has water stops because I have a hole down here by the cold side and one by the hot side on either side of the main mixing valve here. So if yours doesn't have water stops, no worries, you just get to go ahead and skip to the next step. To install these water stops, they come in 2 pieces. The water stop itself, and then a little retaining nut that holds it in place. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take the stop with the threads facing out and place it all the way down inside that cold hole there. Secondly, I'm going to follow it with the nut, and the nut has 2 sides. You'll notice one side smooth and the other side actually has the hexagon shape. I want to make sure the hexagon shape is facing out. What I'm going to do is I'm going to hand tighten this down on the stem of that water stop as much as I can. And now I need to snug it up just a little bit more. So what I can do is I can use a socket wrench if I have one, and the size of this nut is 3/8 of an inch. And you might be able to get it in there and tighten it up without having to remove anything else. However, a lot of times you don't have one handy, you might need to use a crescent wrench or something similar, so you'll need to remove the plaster guard to get access to that nut to really tighten that water stop up. Now to remove the plaster guard, you're going to have to remove the 2 bonnet nuts. The bottom one down here, it just spins right off, and then also the one to the diverter at the top, which you also should be able to remove by hand. I'm going to go ahead and pull those off, set those to the side. Next, the plaster guard, this black piece, is kept in place by 1 Phillips head screw here. I'm going to go ahead and loosen that screw, being careful not to lose it. And now I can pull the entire plaster guard right off the valve. And now with that plaster guard off, I've got great access to go ahead and tighten up the rest of this nut here. So I'm going to go ahead and do that, and then repeat the same steps for the other side. Then we can start reassembling everything, and then we'll be ready to pressure test our system. All right, now that I have those water stops installed, the next step is to make sure they're fully closed. And so to make sure they're closed, I'm going to go ahead and use my Flathead Screwdriver and screw the stop all the way into the body of the valve. So I can check by go ahead and using the screwdriver. You'll notice it kind of bottoms out there, and that's how I know it's fully closed. I'm going to repeat the same steps for the hot side. It's about like 6 or 7 turns to go from fully open to fully closed. You'll feel just a little bit of resistance. You don't need to over tighten it, and that's how I know both sides are fully in the closed position now. Now that I have those closed, I can go ahead and reassemble my plaster guard and my 2 bonnet nuts. It's the same steps as before, just in reverse order. Okay, things are looking great. So now that we've got everything back together, we're going to go ahead and use our flathead screwdriver again, and I'm going to unscrew both of these water stops this time. And basically what that does is open up those valves and allow water to flow throughout the rest of our system. So this time I'm going to use my screwdriver to turn those counterclockwise. And again, it should be about like 6 or 7 turns until you feel it bottom out. Just a little bit of pressure. That's how you know it's fully open. Same thing on the other side. Again, just until I feel a little bit of pressure, and that's how I know it's all the way open. I can also visually check this just because you'll see a bunch of threads on each side. And what those water stops are allowing now is by being open, allowing water from both the hot and the cold side to work through the valve and then to all of our fixtures. So when we pressure test everything, we'll make sure we're testing all of our connections. All right, now before we actually do our pressure test, there's just a few more things I want to check. The first thing is to make sure that my valve body is tight to my blocking, there's no wiggle to it, and that feels pretty good. Second, I just want to visually check all my connections one last time to make sure everything looks good. Everything looks great on that side. And then finally, I also want to make sure that my test caps and my bonnet nuts are nice and hand tight there to make sure there's not going to be any leaking that could happen during my pressure test. All right, everything looks great. So what we're going to do now is this system's totally ready to have the water pressure run through it. And when this happens, I'm just going to visually check to see if I see any drips at any of my locations, if anything needs to be fixed. And after that, that wraps things up for the installation of this R22000 MultiChoice integrated shower valve. All right, I hope everything went well with that install. And if you have any additional questions, you can always reach out to Delta Faucet's customer service team. They're more than happy to help.